Welcome to Horror in Detail. Story 1. It wasn't a little girl. I was camping with my husband and his family at a small, remote lake in New Mexico. There were about 10 people in our group and another group of 6 people in the next campsite. It was nighttime and both groups were doing typical activities, making s'mores, having a few drinks and telling stories, when we all heard what sounded like a little girl yelling out for help. Neither group had children with them, but we were all positive we were hearing a little girl and decided to search the area we heard the noises from together. There was a field behind our campsites, and we all saw a very tall, pure white figure standing maybe 100 feet away from us in the field, making the noises. We all agreed this thing looked maybe 6 feet tall, skinny, and white as can be. We made our way closer to investigate, but whatever it was that we saw started backing off as we got closer, and it disappeared into the trees. All night we continued to hear a little girl calling for help as we tried to sleep. Story 2. The Walking Dead. I'm a psychiatric nurse and early in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. One of our residents was an elective mute, which means that he wouldn't talk, but there were no medical reasons as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life and in fact seemed quite normal back then, with the exception of being close to 7 feet tall. He'd been raised in the Deep South and joined the military when he was 19, but one night he vanished. He was declared AWOL, and eventually he was declared missing and dead. 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into a VA hospital emergency room in my part of the Midwest and said to the receptionist, "My name is Marion Duchesne, not the real name, and I've been dead for 10 years. Those were the last words he ever spoke. He was covered with dust, and he was wearing the same clothes he'd been reported to be wearing the night he vanished. His social security number had not been used and he had no identification on his person. However, they were able to identify him, I guess via fingerprints. The family was notified but they said they had already grieved their lost man and that whomever was claiming to be him simply could not be. They demanded not to be contacted again. Marion paced all day every day, moving his mouth that looked like talking or muttering, but no sound came out. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open as if he were laughing heartily, but not even a breath could be heard. If I talked to him, he appeared to listen, periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. Various medications were tried, but they did not affect him either positively or negatively. Occupational therapy did nothing because Marion would just grin and unless told to stay put, he'd get up and start pacing again. On my last day at that job, the last thing I saw was Marion, pacing in the parking lot, throwing his head back to laugh. Later I wondered if all along I'd been dealing with a ghost. All these years later, I still don't know. Story 3. The Unrest Stop. I was driving across country with my mom and sister when I was 16 and my sister was 20. It was late, but we were well rested still and alert. We were driving along an interstate and needed gas and a bathroom break, so we stopped at the only rest stop in 200 miles. There was a van full of teenagers on a road trip at the gas station, as well as a small gray car parked at the pump in front of us with 2 young men standing still outside of it. When we got there everything felt wrong. We'd been on the road for days and seen many rest stops at night and had never been afraid until then. My mom and sister went inside and I stayed in the car. I heard the teenagers say they were creeped out and couldn't get the pump to work, and they left in a hurry. I was watching the car in front of us, and the two men had not moved at all. Not an inch. They weren't talking. They weren't on phones. They were just standing there, still as stone. My sister and mom came running back out to the car, and when they got in, the two men slowly turned to look at us while not moving or pivoting the rest of their bodies, and I swear to fucking shit, we all saw the same thing. They had eyes dark as pitch and empty. Truly empty. Not black, not reflecting any light at all, just a void. We sped out of there and didn't stop until we were in the next city. The worst thing about the entire experience. We couldn't find the place on any map. We knew exactly which spot on the interstate to look, and we couldn't find it on Google Maps or any paper map we had. We even asked locals about the creepy gas station out on that stretch of road and got only confused looks. We've traveled on that interstate since, and there is no rest stop. Story 4. It came for us in the graveyard. Years ago, a few friends and I went to hang out in a graveyard. Stupid thing to do for a bunch of bored 18-year-olds on a weekday night, but what happened next was very real to all of our experiences. We were driving my friend's really old beat-up Subaru through the massive graveyard. We stopped to get out and walk around. We walked down a hill and came across a little pond. There was someone sitting on a rock on the other side of the pond. The figure was all black and we couldn't make out any features other than the fact it looked like a man who was wearing some old-style top hat. Stupid us waved and shouted "Hi." He didn't show any acknowledgement or wave back. The man sat on the rock, still. All of a sudden, he jumped to his feet, started running to us on the water and then vanished in thin about halfway on the pond. My friends and I screamed and ran back to her car. I didn't want to believe what we saw, but we all saw it happen. We got back to her car and tried to start it. It wouldn't start. Frantically trying to get it started, we all started panicking and getting very scared. That's when we heard some banging on the car from the back. It wasn't a constant bang, but every few seconds or so we'd hear it. Nobody was outside from what we could see in the dark, but something was making a noise on the car. At this point, I'm having a full-blown panic attack, screaming and crying to get us out. Luckily my friend seemed a bit less panicky than I was, and helped keep me calm. It was obvious that they were just as freaked out, however more speechless and pale-faced. We would have left the car in the graveyard and walked the long journey to the exit, if it wasn't for the banging on the car. We didn't want to get out and leave. After about minute, the banging stopped. I'll call my mom to come give us a boost, I thought. I'm not entirely sure why none of us thought to call sooner, however I don't believe anyone thinks rationally while panicking. At this point, 15 minutes had gone by since we got back in her car. I opened my phone and started dialing and realized I had no service. None of us had any cell service. We bantered back and forth for a few more minutes trying to figure out what to do, and decided against leaving the car because whatever was outside was not what we wanted to come face to face with. The next 30 minutes were spent trying to get her car started. No banging was heard afterwards, but we felt this heavy feeling around us. Almost as if it created this pressure on our chest. It's quite difficult to explain as I've never felt anything like it before. Finally, her car started and she hit the pedal to the metal. We sped out of the graveyard so fast. Immediately crossing the gates, all of our phones regained cell service. I'll never be able to explain what caused any of this or why certain things happened. One thing I know for certain is that someone or something was out there, and it was not an animal or human. Story 5. It was good to see an old friend. When I was 37, I went to my high school reunion. I flew into the nearest airport and rented a car. The distance was about 35 miles through a very rural and almost abandoned part of the country. About 3 miles outside of town I see someone on the side of the road, flagging me down. Up in the North Woods, no one ever leaves someone stranded. It turned out that it was one of the guys I had attended school with. I will call him Jim. Jim gets in the car and we start talking. I had not seen him in 20 years, but he still looked the same, maybe a little older. We get to town and I ask him if he wants to come to the VFW and have a drink. He says, "No, just take me home." Jim's parents had lived only a few blocks from my grandmother's house and I turned in that direction, but he said to take him to a part of town that was really on the outskirts, up by the fairgrounds and the cemetery. There was a mobile home park out there and I figured that is where he lived. When we reached the end of the turnoff he said, "Just drop me here. It was good to see you again," and he walks off into the night. I go to the VFW, met some of my old classmates, we start to talk. Now, please understand, I have never done drugs nor do I drink more than soda pop. I was stone cold sober. Tired after a 13-hour flight that had included a 3-hour layover but sober. As we are talking about who is coming to the reunion, I mentioned that I had just picked Jim up 3 miles east of town and had dropped him off up by the fairgrounds. Everyone gets real quiet, even the guy singing karaoke stops and lays down the mic. My cousin goes white as a new cotton t-shirt. "Barb, Jim died on that curve 8 years ago. Rolled his car. We were all at his funeral." I start to feel really dizzy. I go out to the car to take some deep breaths and decide whether or not I am sane. There on the seat is the local newspaper, printed 8 years previous, containing Jim's obituary. I still have the damn paper. Every now and then I take it out and stare at it and still wonder WTF happened. Story 6. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. This happened to my brother and not me. We were told that a woman had died from her abusive husband in the house and she hated men because of it. And yeah, she hated men. Dad would wake up with scratches all over himself, and whenever my brother was mean to my sister or he would have scratches on him as well. One day my brother hurt his twin sister. He hit her or something. I don't remember the full details of what he did, but when he woke up later that night he had a horrible bloody nose. Another thing that happened is we had this huge almost 100-pound dresser that has been in the family for a while. We have 2 small dogs, a Chihuahua and a rat terrier. One night my rat terrier woke up and let out this scream we've never heard from him before, and at the same time the dresser fell over. When we looked at it, it was pushed from the wall about 4 feet before getting knocked over. Our dogs could never have done that. The day we moved out, my brother accidentally broke his twin's arm, trying out a wrestling move. He swears that he would have died that night if it wasn't our last in the house. Story 7. Death came for him. I was standing in my parents' room, talking to my very sick dad at the time, stage 4 esophageal cancer, and for some reason I get the feeling something is behind me. I look into the doorway to the living room and something about 4 feet 6 inches and fully black, it was nighttime, is peeking around the corner, with their hands on the door frame. I run towards it and it peeks back around the door. Nothing. My dad is completely confused when I step back inside the room when I tell him. People who stayed at my house have claimed to see it. My mom saw the figure on multiple occasions in multiple places until he passed away. We haven't seen it since. Story 8. My mother attracted evil. 2 was around 16 when this happened. I happened to lay in bed, reading something. The room at first would feel normal. Then it started to feel really icy. Not that the room got cold, but just the feeling it gave me, if that makes sense. It felt really uncomfortable. Next it would feel as if somebody just stared at you. There wasn't nobody there, nor did I see a thing. But just the feeling that something looked at you hate-filled was enough for me. Often I got the feeling, leave the room. So I did, and then just played a video game of some sort. The thing had left the room after about an hour or so. This happened about 3 times. In the same home, flat really, 3 other things happened that were weird. The first was a shadow person sneaking along the walls of my bedroom during the day. Second, we had a dog, a small one named DJ. Think something along the size of a fox terrier and you've got it. One day I came to collect something from my room. It was during the day and DJ followed me in. I heard a deep growling from under the bed. At first, I thought, must have been the dog. But I already knew that DJ wasn't capable of making this deep of a noise. It sounded either like a really big dog or a man doing his best and kinda scary growling impression. This happened only once, but the experience just stuck with me. Another weird thing with the dog was the time he was afraid to come to the living room. Next to my bedroom there was a small room, we used it as a computer room. DJ was in there at the time and I heard him whimpering and pacing. Even growling lowly at a thing that was in the hallway. I called him, but he didn't budge. I had to come and pick him up and then remove him from the room. They all happened at the same flat. I lived there a few years with my mom after the divorce. Things happened, and I left her home to live with my dad. She moved a few months later, but I think she was the one that carried this thing with her. At my dad, a few small things happened but nothing like the experiences with my mother. Story 9. Evicted by a ghost. Shortly after college, I got married. We immediately moved into a basement apartment because that's all that was available within our budget. This place had a poltergeist, and my wife was terrified. Whatever resided there with us made it clear it wanted to live alone. Dishes, glasses, and other items would fly off the shelf. My wife was hit several times. There was always an ominous feeling like we were being watched. At night when we walked through the apartment in the dark, there would be insanely bright flashes of light that would illuminate the entire room. One night while we were going to bed, as soon as my wife and I walked into the bedroom, we heard a voice from nowhere say, "My name, move." My wife looked at me, I looked at her, I said loudly, "You've got it, bud." We moved out 2 days later and stayed with family. The old lady who owned the place died a few months later, and the house was torn down. It is still an empty lot to this day, nothing but grass and a tree. I still drive by it every now and again. Story 10. The Death March. My dad used to work as a CO, corrections officer, at a rural prison. He drove perimeter, which just means he made circles around the jail in a truck, checking empty buildings for runaway inmates and just generally being bored for 8 hours every night. One night, my dad is parked on a hill just reading a magazine when he starts to feel a thumping in his body. He described it as the feeling you get when speakers are playing a song with really heavy bass and you can feel the bass in your whole body. Anyway, he puts the magazine down and checks his rear view, and he sees someone outside the truck. He grabs his pistol and jumps out of the truck, weapon drawn. When he gets outside, he sees a procession of Native Americans walking through the truck, and directly through his seat, only to disappear at the exact spot he was sitting. He said it was clear they were ghosts because many of them appeared injured. This went on for a few seconds, and then whole procession disappeared. He called the other perimeter guy on his walkie to try to explain, and the other guy almost immediately stopped communicating. Turns out the other guy had seen this happen before, but didn't believe in ghosts, so he wouldn't talk about it. Story 11. The Demon's Room. I worked as a forensic nurse in a hospital's lock-up unit. We had one older lady who swore she was being haunted and abused by a demon she would call Tiberius. So many crazy things happened while she was on the unit. We'd go into the room, do normal care, leave, and seconds later she'd start screaming bloody murder. We'd run into the room to find her looking like she'd been in a fight with a boxing champ, bloody lip, black eye, markings all over her body. No one ever saw her doing this stuff to herself. Things would get moved around the room by themselves. At one point she was in protective restraints because the doctor thought she was hurting herself. There was no way she could have moved or done anything to herself while in these restraints, but new marks would always appear or her tray/cart would be across the room. The room was secure, so there was no way someone else was doing this. When we asked her questions, she'd just say, "It was Tiberius." After she was discharged, we always had trouble with that room. If there was going to be a rapid response or code, it happened in that room. One night a guard reported lights blinking on and off. It was that room.